Submitted for your approval. Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension. Self.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Hello, hello, hello. You're listening to a podcast not only of sound, but also of mind. It's Time to Rewind is a podcast that takes a journey into a wondrous land of time loops whose boundaries are that of imagination. I'm your host, Bubbawheat, and each episode my guest and I explore these time loops one loop at a time. This stop is Trapped in the Twilight Zone, and this is the third and final stop at 1959's Season 1, Episode 10, Judgement Night. Here with me is my guest Lackey from Inner Time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been a lot of fun going through these few classic episodes of the Twilight Zone over and over again.
Almost like you're trapped within one of these Twilight Zones, where it is your fate to do the same thing over and over.
Yes, and this, in terms of the scheduling, this is the third time that I'm discussing Judgement Night, and I've gone through. I've recorded the Death Ship episodes already, one of the Shadow Play episodes already. So it's been interesting rewatching these three episodes of the Twilight Zone. I'm a little disappointed in myself that I haven't given myself time to expand and watch any of the other classic Twilight Zone episodes. But I'm pretty sure you do have a better history with the Twilight Zone. Why don't you talk about that for a minute?
So the Twilight Zone was one of the first things to really kind of scare me. Really kind of scare, like the sort of the story that I as I remember it, this would have been when I was a young, not like young, but I think I probably would have been like 7 or 8 when I saw Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. And Nightmare at 20,000 Feet was the, if you recall, that's the episode where William Shatner is on a plane and he becomes convinced there's a monster on the wing of the plane sabotaging the flight. And there's this wonderful scene where William Shatner pulls the curtain of the plane window aside and sees the monster with its face pressed up against the glass, peering back at him. And that just scared me to no end. I do not believe I got any sleep that night. I had a neurosis about sleeping in a room with unclevered windows that lasted into my 30s. It's only been comparatively recent in my life where I can sleep in a room if there's no window treatments, like no blinds, no curtains, or even if the blinds or the curtains are open, I used to have to close them because I was just afraid of that thing. And it's a pretty stupid looking monster nowadays.
Yeah.
The writer of that episode, Richard Matheson, described it as looking like a surly teddy bear. But, just the things that kind of get you when you're that age, when you're young and impressionable.
Yeah, for me it was Gremlins, and it's funny because I just watched those two movies over Halloween, but I had a similar experience whenever I was about that same age, 6 or 7. Only for me it was mirrors, and I had a mirror in my bedroom, and I basically just stacked clothes up on top of it, so I couldn't see it.
Right. But yeah, at that impressionable an age, that's when I think the things that kind of really that's a great, I think, age to be traumatized by horror fiction, by horror television and movies. I think that's when you're that at that age, you're young and impressionable. You're old enough to kind of be able to kind of poke your eyes around the corner and try to put yourself in a more adult world.
And I think for most people it has one of two results. Either it scares the hell out of them and they enjoy that feeling on a certain level and they continue to seek it out and become lifelong horror fans, or it scares the hell out of them and they don't necessarily like that feeling and so they completely swear off of horror films for the next, until they're maybe a teenager or a young adult before they give it a try again.
Uh-huh. And it was another couple of years, I think, before I really started. I didn't get immediately into. See, at that age, that was like also we're talking about the early to mid '80s here, so that was when stuff like Friday the 13th and the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise were in full swing, and that stuff didn't interest me. I don't think I really. I mean, that's kind of like that, and seeing Poltergeist. There's a scene in Poltergeist that had a very similar effect on me. Um, but I don't think that I really started to look more into horror until I really developed a fascination with Alien, probably about age 14 or 15, and that's when I really started kind of biting into horror as a genre, and that's I think what made me fall in love with it. But ultimately, I think the seed was planted back with the Twilight Zone.
Do you remember? I guess was it just did you just happen to catch it like as a rerun on TV?
Yeah, I think it was. I don't even remember exactly why I wanted. I remember that I wanted to watch the Twilight Zone. It was one of those things that had a, the anthology film, had come out a couple years previous. I didn't know what it was, but I heard stuff about it that it was. I don't know. I remember my mom would tell me about the scene in the film, the want to see something really scary scene, but it was just one of those things that just it like I said, I keep coming back to the word mystique, but that's what I can say about it. It had a sort of thing to it that just kind of drew me. It's like, oh, this is something I hear my parents talking about, or this is something I hear other kids talking about. This is something that I kind of want to experience for myself. And it just happened to be, I think that was the first episode I ever saw. So, start off with a bang.
Uh,
I don't remember I even watched it again until I had a fear of it going almost into my 20s, and I don't think I really started to explore the rest of the Twilight Zone until well into the mid 90s, when I started looking up other episodes like Eye of the Beholder and the Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, the first ones that I watched when I started really kind of experimenting and exploring it more.
Oh, at this point, have you seen like all of them now, or have you just hit the some of the select like the high points?
Um, I go through kind of phases where I'll just kind of pick episodes to watch. I have not seen them all. There are so many. Um,
Yeah.
Seasons of television obviously were much longer then, and I think that even though it ran for only 3 seasons, I think there's got to be something like almost 100 episodes.
Well, there's five
Um,
seasons, but I think two of the seasons were short seasons.
oh, five? I thought there were only three. Oh, I must be thinking of Star Trek. Um, Yeah, because now that I think about it, yeah, they had shortened seasons and they had the seasons with the hour-long episodes. But
Yeah.
no, I haven't seen them all. If I have broadcast TV, if I have access to broadcast TV, there's a station here in Chicago that often runs them, and I would watch. Even a couple years ago, I was catching up on a bunch of ones I'd never seen. Um, like I think it was called the 16 millimeter Shrine, the one with the I cannot remember the name of it, but it's the one with it's pretty famous in its twist ending. It's the one where there's a bus accident and everybody goes to this diner and there's some sort of threats about aliens, and it turns out that the guy at the soda counter is an three-eyed alien. Um, Spoilers, I guess. I can't remember the name of that one.
I don't remember that one either.
Well, I just blew it for you in case you ever run across it at random, so I apologize for that. Finally got to see The Invasion, which was one that I had heard a lot of great stuff about, and it really was as effective as I'd heard. But it's not something like I don't go to it all the time. I have a lot of my attention span is gets pretty short in my old age, and it's trying to watch more than 3 or 4 episodes of anything kind of turns into a tedious exercise for me.
I know how that is. I have a hard time um, really getting into very many TV shows just because I can't. Because I have a newborn in the house now, and so it's hard for me to focus on what I'm watching 100%. And it's like, I don't want to put something on that I need to focus 100% on because I know I'm not going to be able to focus for the entire runtime of it. So I end up
Right.
just putting up, a lot of background noise programs like reality trash and stuff like that, stuff
Yeah.
that I don't really care about. So
Right.
if I miss 10 minutes of it, it's not a big deal.
Right.
But I know, coming back to this episode, Judgment Night, did you remember or have a history with this episode in particular, or was this mostly a new experience for you?
I could have sworn that I had seen this or had some sort of exposure to it in the past because um, this one, I remember there being one set on a ship that was in a time loop, and it was during World War II. But I don't know. Maybe there's another one, or maybe I'm confusing it with an episode of something else that's not even necessarily the Twilight Zone. It could be something from the 80s revival, or for all I know, it could be an Outer Limits episode. Because I seem to remember there being like a comparatively big star in that one, Martin Landau or Martin Balsam or something like that. When I watched Judgment Night, I kind of knew what the story was. I knew that it took, it's like I knew it took place during World War II. I knew that the main character was going to turn out to be, a U-boat captain. But I actually remembered very little, if nothing, of what I was seeing. Nothing looked familiar. Nothing was triggering any memories, even though I knew what was going to happen. So, I'm wondering if I'm confused, mixing this up with some other episode, or if I have seen it in the
I think there's
past.
also um, I think a movie that has a relatively similar plot, but I know it's not another Twilight Zone episode because I've already kind of dug into all the Twilight Zone episodes that have some sort of time loop aspect to them.
Uh-huh.
And there's definitely not another one set on a ship or set during World War II. And there was actually surprisingly few of them. There was only, 3 from the classic series, and they all more or less followed the same format as this one, where 95% of the episode was just the straight narrative, and then the loop is revealed at the very end, just the last minute or two of the episode.
Right. It is kind of interesting that they didn't deal with World War II a whole lot, considering I know Rod Serling was a veteran. I don't remember whether he fought in World War II or Korea, but it would have been that's a show that would have been made by World War II veterans, written and directed by them. So I guess I do find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I did get into a little bit of the World War II historical accuracy part and with my last guest. And there are some interesting things like with the wolf pack and that sort of things that were relatively accurate, although the attack at the end was likely not as accurate and probably done more for just the budget, where the attack primarily happened above water rather than
Right,
below the surface.
right. Because the thing that kind of surprised me was how much practical effects went into this, at least with things being on fire. It looked fairly realistic, like they actually did set stuff on fire. So I don't know how practical it would have been for them to film. I think that this may obviously, obviously the Twilight Zone was done on a low budget, but this one seemed to be it seemed to me like they had limited the sets so that they could kind of get the expense of burning them down.
They reused a lot of sets, and I don't have the research. Like I didn't copy it down, but I did see that the majority of the ship set was pulled from a previous MGM movie, and so
Okay.
they reused that. So it happened a lot on the Twilight Zone.
Sure, sure.
But in general, I've already discussed this episode a couple times, so I'm curious to see, what your thoughts are and kind of, what you want to talk about with this
It's
episode.
um I find it very interesting. This was one of the ones that was actually written by Rod Serling. One of the things that I found is that most of my favorite episodes of The Twilight Zone weren't actually written by Serling. Um, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet was written by Richard Matheson, the great horror author who also he wrote. I think the main thing that mainly I think that most people would associate him with him was either The Shrinking Man or I Am Legend. The
And he did also write Death Ship, which is another episode that I'll be covering next.
Okay. Um, Charles Beaumont, who went on to create the Waltons, also wrote. I think he wrote. I could be wrong about this, but I believe he wrote Eye of the Beholder. I could be wrong about that. I do know that he wrote several episodes of the show. Um, Rod Serling's episodes. Rod Serling, I don't think, was always as interested in kind of the horror aspect necessarily of the Twilight Zone. I don't think he was as interested in being as scary as, say, Matheson was. Um, Serling's episodes are often like moral fables. I think that Judgment Night is a great example of this, where um, the purpose of it, the story, is to basically it has a moral core to it. It's trying to actually tell a moral story, and most of the ones that he tends to write. I mean, I do like a lot of the ones that he's written. My favorite is one that he wrote, which is The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Oh, I guess I'm wrong. I guess he did write Eye of the Beholder.
But one thing that I did notice this time watching it, which I think I talked a little bit about in an earlier discussion, but I feel like everything that's going on to Carl Lancer in this episode is designed to amplify his punishment, his afterlife punishment. Everything from his selective memory loss. He only remembers certain things, and I think that that's purposefully designed to, at the beginning, it brings him into the fold to where he becomes interested in the other passengers. And, the other passengers talk to him, he talks to them, they get to know each other. And I think that that's him not remembering that he was a U-boat captain at that point in time is done on purpose, so that way he begins to know his eventual victims. And then the memories start coming back to where he is a U-boat captain, and that is designed as the episode goes on to otherify him, so that he is introduced to the other passengers, but then he's immediately separated from them.
Sure. There's something of a trope, I guess you could call it, of the somewhat callous U-boat captain. A similar kind of character occurs in H.P. Lovecraft's short story, The Temple, which in a way could have been, it very well could have been a Twilight Zone itself, or an episode of Night Gallery. There is definitely some sort of moral agency that's imposing this punishment upon Glazer, to kind of show him, and kind of prove to him what he refuses to see about, the things he refuses to see about what he considers the enemy, what he just considers, they don't matter, and he has to, he's forced to learn about their lives and to learn about them as people, while not having a grasp on who he is as a person.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's also, it introduces this sense of dread to where they're in this thick fog. They have lost the convoy, and they know that they're in waters that have the potential to have German U-boats patrolling them. So there's that threat of the German U-boats in order to have him in a constant state of fear. And then that just gets amplified as, more of his memories come back, and, he gets the memory of the 1:15 time towards the end. And also, the engines, they shut down so that the ship is dead in the water. And that just continues to amplify his fear. And then it's kind of comes to a climax whenever he finally gets to the point where he sees the U-boats, and he is in a position where, he knows the people that are on this ship now, and he wants to rescue them. But then as he scours the ship, then everybody's gone. Since they're, this is the afterlife, they're all spirits, and that also, that's just a further level of his punishment. He is at the point where he's trying to do what he thinks is the right thing at that point in time, but he's unable to do that because nobody's there.
He's unable to do it, and he faces that punishment completely alone.
Yes.
That's actually, I kind of missed that. That's actually a really good observation. But it's very much a very atmospheric episode, and very effectively directed, even I would say by 1959 standards. I mean, it does look a little bit claustrophobic now. It looks a little bit, if not, I wouldn't necessarily say cheap, but it has a very limited scope in terms of its use of sets, which I think gives it a claustrophobic feel that is, I think, intensified by the use of fog. It just, not only in the thematic sense, but in the visual sense. And I think that you get this creeping, as you said, this creeping feeling of dread, that that something is going to happen, and it's, something's going to happen, and that this guy is in a position, or maybe he was in a position to stop it, and he's got to try to stop it. And it's only at the end when you realize that it's what it is, what's going on. But it is, I think, a fascinating. I don't know if I'd put it as one of my favorite Twilight Zones, but it's a fascinating piece of drama, of short drama. Just the themes that it works with, and the one bit that really kind of stuck with me was the final conversation he's having at the end of I guess the end of the loop for him, or the beginning of the loop, I'm not sure, but
it's basically a flashback.
The flashback to when he was the U-boat captain, and he's talking to his lieutenant, and the lieutenant says, I wonder, we shouldn't be doing this. We're not warning them. We're not following, these are things that we are doing that we should not be doing. Are we damned because of this? Are not in the eyes of, the mortal authorities, but does God see what we're doing? And has God, will God, pass judgment on us? And, that's, the Lancer's kind of like, oh, kind of treats it kind of like, yeah, whatever, not knowing.
He's in a very arrogant position. He thinks that he's doing the right thing at that moment in time. And he even sees from the British perspective, but he doesn't care.
Right.
He even says, yeah, from the British point of view, we're damned. But he's like, well, I don't care. That's a war trophy for me. It was a 5,000 5,000 tonnage, or whatever the terminology was for that ship.
Right. That's a feather in my cap right there. That's a potential promotion in the whatever, I would assume the Navy, the German Navy, or whatever military branch headed that up. It is a pretty weighty piece of drama for something that was, done in 1959, and I don't think that we really. I think we kind of like to invent the idea of prestige drama. That television wasn't. I think a lot of people seem to think that television wasn't serious before The Sopranos went on the air. That you couldn't make serious drama on TV. At least when I grew up, I had this. There was very much this sort of attitude that many people had that TV was kind of like the
dumping ground, or where movie stars go to die.
Yeah. It's it was kind of like it was television was for the most part stupid and inane, and that you couldn't really do weighty drama with it. And every so often you would get things like Twin Peaks or something like that, but it just basically seemed, and this really kind of proves that there is kind of like you can do something like with weighty themes of what the meaning of our actions, and whether our actions, the existence of God, the existence of an afterlife, the existence of heaven and hell, whether our actions, the ultimate karmic, this is a karmic punishment for Glazer, so the idea of do your actions now, do they have repercussions for your next life, and what are those repercussions going to look like, and are you going to be Are you going to be treated with the same, with whatever respect you treated others with? Are you going to be seen that way? Are you going to be made to sympathize with the people that you have abused, that you have killed, that you have maimed? Those sorts of things. And I think this is as a work of drama does it very well.
And in terms of the Twilight Zone as a whole, this is never one of the ones that I see in terms of like the more well-known episodes. But I do think, at least for me, that this episode did hold up pretty well to repeat viewings and to really looking at it with a critical eye and analyzing it at the level that I've been doing uh, with this show, and I think it does hold up as a good episode. I probably agree that I think in terms of the overall narrative, it probably isn't one of the best, that like the top tier Twilight Zone episodes, but I do think that it's worth watching, and it does hold up. It has a lot of narrative value, and the just everything that's going on lends itself to looking at it with a critical eye and an analytical eye, and a lot of this stuff does hold up as a fascinating episode overall.
Uh-huh. And I would agree there. It's not, it's, to me, what I will say about this is that this is, I think, the Twilight Zone summed up what the Twilight Zone did and what its strengths were, I think, summed up in a good 25-minute package. It's what I think it almost stands as maybe even the epitome of the Rod Serling episode, the sort of thing that he was trying to tell. It may use a science fiction or fantastical thing at its core, but it's ultimately a very human drama dealing with human themes. With what the cartoonist Michael Kupperman, hi Sharon, would have called deep, satisfying irony. I'm just made a call out to my friend Sharon, who introduced me to Michael Kupperman's comics. But yeah, I think it really, it may not, I don't think it really stuck in people's minds the way, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet did, or Eye of the Beholder, or any of the ones that, or It's a Good Day, or any of the ones that, I think really kind of stuck in the mind. It's not one that kind of sticks in the mind like those, but it is, I think, a classic episode in the sense that it features everything that I've come to kind of think of as being the Twilight Zone. I don't necessarily want to say formula, as if it's a bad thing, but what the Twilight Zone did. It's a classic episode in what everything that the Twilight Zone did and did well. Its mission statement, yeah. Its mission statement is an episode like this. It's Rod Serling trying to say something about the human condition.
Yeah.
And for the most part, succeeding.
Yeah, there were just a couple other little details that, or a couple little trivia things that I noticed about the episode that I did want to point out that I haven't had a chance to. This is one of the, this does have one of the issues that Rod Serling suffered throughout some of the, I believe he called it one of his biggest struggles with the Twilight Zone, was that of censorship. And
I was going to say, let me guess, sponsors.
Yes, because
yeah.
This is a British vessel, but the Carl Lancer, he's offered coffee instead of tea, and that was a studio note because the sponsor had coffee, but they didn't have tea. And so that was one of the pushes from the studio that he wasn't able to have tea because it was tea in the script. And that was one of the changes that he referred to as censorship, basically. That they made him change that so it wouldn't offend the censors. I mean, offend the sponsors.
Yeah, it's again maybe a weird thing to remember that there was a time when a television show could entirely be underwritten by one or two sponsors. And there's even even going back and looking at things that are beloved. It's like I remember just looking at there's like a bit of Charlie Brown Christmas that explicitly endorses Coke products, and they cut it out these days when they rerun it. You can find it on YouTube. But yeah, that Rod Serling always had problems with studio interference and sponsor interference.
Other detail that I wanted to point out is something that he mentions in the closing narration, where he talks about the ledger of his life is opened and examined, the tally made, and then the reward or the penalty paid. And personally, I think that's very interesting because of it's something that's been used quite frequently in the MCU with Black Widow. She often refers to having red in her ledger, and she's trying to even that out by doing good to offset the red in her ledger. And I just thought that terminology was interesting, seeing that in this episode, and compared to how it's and it's basically used in the same way.
Right. The metaphor of using the metaphor of using it's an old metaphor. This is almost kind of like a financial. It is a financial metaphor. So, saying like the looking at the ledger of your life and seeing what you've to quote the Beatles, the love you've taken and the love you've given, or what you've paid and what you owe. It's a bit of an old metaphor, but it's one that I think Sterling really uses evocatively here.
Was there anything else that you wanted to mention about the episode before we wrap up here?
Just a couple of things that just minor things about the casting that I noticed that just a couple of minor cameos from people who would go on to become fairly famous. The first officer on the SS Queen of Glasgow is played by Patrick Macnee from the original Mr. Steed from the Avengers television show in the 60s. And Lanzer's lieutenant on the U-boats, played by James Franciscus, who I think has appeared in at least one or two films that have been MST3K'd.
Yeah, he did have. I didn't recognize him at all, but he did. He does kind of have that look, so that doesn't surprise me too much. But I'd like to thank you for talking with me about this, and I'd especially like to thank you because for those who might not know, you actually provided the music for the first season and this season of this show. And it's something that I really love, and you provided the music, and I layered in the clips, the audio clips.
I'm glad you enjoy it, and thank you for having me on.
So, for anybody listening to this, why don't you go ahead and let them know where they can find you online? And I know you're just started your the podcast, so you can take a minute to talk about that.
So Jason Soto and I have just started a new podcast. It's called From Inner Time, and we discuss Doctor Who, going in another direction of my interest in old television of a genre persuasion. We just recorded our third episode, which should be released, I think, in a week or so. It can be found at, I believe the URL is rabbitholepodcast.com. Jason has something of a budding podcast empire and has a lot of podcasts on a number of different subjects. But the one, like I said, with Doctor Who being the topic of ours, we're kind of comparing and contrasting the original show that ran from 63 to 89, and we're contrasting older episodes with episodes from the revival that started in 2005 and is continuing to run to this day. So again, that's rabbitholepodcast.com, and can also be found, I think it's also available on Spotify and iTunes and other places that you find podcasts.
As always, I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me at flightstitesandmovienights.com. You can find me on Twitter at Bubbawheat, and you can find this show, It's Time to Rewind, on Anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else where you listen to podcasts. I also have a Facebook group, It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group, where you can join that and discuss episodes as they come out. And you can also discuss other time loop movies and time loop episodes there as well. It's a lot of fun. And so until next time, I'll still be right here, trapped in the Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval. Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted
Light.
for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted
Light.
for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted
Light.
for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension. Self.
Submitted
Light.
for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone. And in the case of Karl Lancer, former Kapitan Leutnant, Navy of the Third Reich, this is the penalty. This is the justice meted out. This is Judgment Night in the Twilight Zone.